Mr. President, I first want to acknowledge the severity of the challenges that we face as a country right now, whether it's military action to stop the threat from ISIS or the crisis in Ukraine. Colorado is waiting anxiously to hear from the President tonight, and we are all concerned with that, as we should be. Today on the floor of the Senate, Mr. President, is a constitutional amendment, and while the proposed amendment, and while it's on the floor, I wanted to take a minute to talk about it. Tonight in Colorado, a swing state, families will endure an avalanche of political ads, and many of them will come from obscured interests with deceptive names such as America, Inc., the Government Integrity Fund Action Network, something called Citizens for a Working America, and so on and so forth. And there will be no way to tell who these folks are, because under the laws of the United States, many of these organizations don't have any obligation to disclose where their money comes from, a privileged status that individual Americans do not have when it comes to funding political campaigns. It's enough to make everyone in our state, in Colorado, hate their TV, much less American politics, and probably not in that order. In Washington, on the other hand, and I guess I should say only in Washington, which has become a Disneyland when it comes to any sense of reality, there are people defending the current system, the current campaign finance system, on the grounds that it's a great victory for free speech and a great victory for our democracy. It's the position of the defenders of the current system that what we need in our politics is more money, not less. That more money is going to help our politics, not less. I have never met a Coloradan who thinks what's wrong with our politics is that we don't have enough money in it. In fact, they believe the reverse. They believe the exact opposite. That's because they know our system of financing campaigns, far from being about elucidating the truth, is a system expressly designed to obscure the truth. From Colorado's perspective, it's a system that's really good for the special interests and the occupiers of the past, and really terrible for the American people and for our future. Over the last several months, almost every one of us at some point has lamented the Senate's inability to address the big issues facing our nation, whether it's reforming our broken immigration system or creating a more competitive tax code that encourages innovation and helps produce an economy that lifts middle-class family income again in this country. Energy, climate, education, and infrastructure are left unanswered as we barely summon the votes to approve another non-controversial judge or nominee. My colleagues, we share the pathetic distinction of being on target to becoming the least productive Congress ever. Ever. Close readers of American history will know that this is a particularly ignominious achievement. How will it feel, Mr. President, when the next history books are written, to know that we managed to do even less than the do-nothing Congress? That's how you acquire a Congress that now has a 14% approval rate, below President Nixon even had during the height of Watergate. This less than do-nothing Congress is not just failing the American people on the big issues. We've given up on those for now around here. We're struggling to pass basic appropriation bills to keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent over the long term. Some of my colleagues in this chamber, this land of flickering lights, have argued that the Tea Party and obstruction are to blame. Others have argued that the majority's limits on debate and floor amendments are at the root of the problem. But I think it all starts with our broken campaign finance system, which has never been perfect, but recently has become substantially worse. First, let me say, when I first studied the court's most significant prior opinion on finance, the case of Buckley against Vallejo, decided in the early 70s, it seemed to me even then that if the court had actually understood what had happened as a result of that decision, they might reconsider their holding that money is speech. But by then it was abundantly clear that the wealthier you are, the louder your voice, an outcome that seemed to me at odds with a democracy grounded on the notion of one person, one vote. This isn't to say, that, Mr. President, that we should expect to live in a country where everyone has equal speech. We could never succeed at ensuring that, and we would certainly fail if we tried. But we could address unfair practices and advantages. We could devise common sense regulations of our campaign finance laws to make sure that our government could actually function. We could hope to lift the voices in the town square and on every street corner in the country and reward the effort of each individual American, no matter what they believe, no matter who they were, who became involved in politics to help create the future of this country. We could do that, and in fact, we did do that for decades. We could do it until Citizens United was decided, when the court not only didn't wince at its holding in Buckley, but doubled down, holding, among other things, that independent expenditures do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. An absurd proposition on its face to anyone who serves in the United States Congress. Also in McCutcheon, another opinion, the Supreme Court held that there is, quote, only one legitimate governmental interest for restricting campaign finances, preventing corruption or the appearance of corruption. That's it. It can't be regulated to do anything else. The court went on to hold that, quote, spending large sums of money in connection with elections, but not in connection with an effort to control the exercise of an office holder's official duties, does not give rise to quid pro quo corruption. Nor does the possibility that an individual who spends large sums may garner influence or access to elected officials or political parties. Think about that for a minute. The majority in McCutcheon doesn't believe that an individual who spends large sums of money would garner influence or access to elected officials. The court doesn't think they're trying to influence our official duties. Could anyone in this chamber really agree with this conclusion with a straight face? In fact, some do agree, but there isn't a single soul in Colorado who does. But to me, the more significant point is that the court failed to recognize how unlimited and undisclosed campaign spending corrupts the very act of governing. This extends far beyond the traditional notion of quid pro quo corruption. In searching pretty much in vain, not entirely, but pretty much in vain, for the pitiful politician hiding cash in his icebox or somewhere beneath the South 40, the court missed the real corruption. And in doing so, these decisions and the looming threat of unchecked spending have led to almost complete paralysis, the end of principled compromise on behalf of the public interest. In his dissent in Citizens United, Justice Stevens warned of this potential problem when he wrote, quote, the influx of unlimited corporate money into the electoral realm also creates new opportunities for the mirror image of quid pro quo deals, threats, both explicit and implicit. Starting today, he wrote, corporations with large war chests to deploy on electioneering may find democratically elected bodies becoming much more attuned to their interests. And that's precisely what we found. Inertia has become the new reality in the Senate, and the House. Congress is now frozen by its own fear of taking on incumbent interests, whether it's our failure to address long-term deficits or create a coherent energy policy. You can see this corruption in the difficult decisions that we avoid. It's the tough vote that we won't take. It's the bill that we can't pass, even in the face of urgent need. It's the deal that can't be reached. It's the speech that's never made. It's the story of the do less than the do nothing Congress. This corruption by its nature is difficult to prove because it's invisible, but it suits the incumbent interest just fine. The court imagined a world where people with bags of money are wandering around Capitol Hill, and only then could you regulate it, trying to get people to do something for them. 90% of what happens around here is people coming, trying to keep you from doing something, trying to keep things the same, trying to keep the incumbent interests embedded in our tax code, in our regulatory code, and our statute book. The Supreme Court was silent completely on that corruption. And I would argue that is at the core of our dysfunction as a Congress. There is a reason the dysfunction that is so hated by the people I represent coincided with the era of these Supreme Court opinions. And this is why everybody in Colorado continue to scratch their heads and wonder how we can be so disconnected from their set of priorities, so decoupled from their set of priorities, what they care about for the future of their families, the future of their businesses, and how we can come here all week and just vote on judges. To my knowledge, there are no super PACs devoted to votes on judges one way or another, which is why maybe that's what we spend our time doing here. I have a lot of respect for the Supreme Court, as I know the presiding officer does, in the separation of powers, and I know how serious it is to consider a constitutional amendment, an amendment to the Constitution, which is why it should be a last, not a first resort. But the court got it wrong when it came to the practical day-to-day operations of this United States Congress and the way campaigns work, and its decisions have unleashed a torrent of new spending that's corroding the vibrancy of our democracy. And I think it's useful for us to take a moment to think about or consider the practical effects of these decisions. During the entire 2010 election cycle, that's the year Citizens United was decided, super PACs spent a total of $63 million in this country. So far, I guess we're on September 10th, in this election cycle, super PACs have spent $116 million. That's almost twice what was spent in 2010, and it's only the beginning of September. There are states where you cannot buy TV because so much TV time has been bought by these outside groups. For the 3 election cycles before Citizens United, outside spending totaled about $113 million. In contrast, in the 3 election cycles since Citizens United was decided, outside spending has totaled about $530 million. This is almost a 5-fold increase in spending. There probably are people around the country that aren't beneficiaries of this incredible speech. Unfortunately, folks in Colorado are, because we're a swing state, as I mentioned at the beginning. And you can't, practically at this point, watch anything else on your television. In 2012, the top 100 individual donors to super PACs, the top 100 people, along with their spouses, represented 1% of all individual donors to super PACs. But their donations totaled 67% of the funding, and therefore 67% of the spending. But the spending doesn't only affect how this place works, as I mentioned earlier, it affects what we work on here. And Mr. President, that's why Congress has repeatedly enacted reasonable limits on campaign spending, which have largely been upheld until very, very recently, until 2010. In fact, as recently as 2003, in FEC versus Beaumont, the Supreme Court found that, quote, any attack on the federal prohibition of direct corporate political contributions goes against the current of a century of congressional efforts to curb corporations' potentially deleterious influences on federal elections. The court made the point that our current laws grew out of the late 19th century belief that aggregated capital, I'm quoting here, unduly influenced politics, an influence not stopping short of corruption. an influence that stops the work of the United States Senate and the House dead in its tracks. And this concern about aggregated capital and its effect on our democracy actually goes back to the earliest days of our country. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison wrote, quote, "We may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name, on a government which derives all its powers, directly or indirectly, from the great body of the people. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of the society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it." So there's nothing unprecedented about seeking to regulate campaign spending. What's unprecedented is the ease by which the Supreme Court has undone decades of campaign finance laws, which has led to the dysfunction here and the misery that folks in Colorado are suffering as they watch these ads. What's unprecedented is the sheer volume of money that's flooding Senate and congressional races, and what's unprecedented is the corrupting influence this money is having on the institution of the United States Congress. Because of this new world of unlimited spending, members of Congress are a lot less likely to seek compromise than they once were and work together if they know that they may become the target of a super PAC from people that can write checks that are larger than my imagination. Reasonable limits on campaign spending can help address this problem. We believe for decades and decades and decades that the Constitution allowed us to do that. The Supreme Court has now decided that we can't, and we're looking at this choice. I would say also, just on this point, Mr. President, that notwithstanding my observations about the court, it is also true that 8 of 9 Supreme Court justices have said that disclosure requirements are constitutional. But disclosure does not require a change to the Constitution, and I, for one, say at least let's pass that. Republicans and Democrats coming together and say, you know what? We've always had an expectation about the First Amendment that you're going to be willing to stand up and say who you are. Why do we let people put, or if maybe we won't require people to say who they are, but we'll just say at the end, paid for people that are so embarrassed about what they're doing that they refuse to put their actual names on this advertisement. But it seems to me that if we can be required to say, I'm Senator so-and-so and I paid for this message, we ought to be able to say that about everybody that's advertising these political ads. Changing these rules, I think, would bring more compromise and consensus building to this institution, but most important above all else, it would help give individual families a greater say in the political process. We offer this amendment not as a one-size-fits-all solution, but to allow Congress and the states to place reasonable limits on campaign spending, to experiment with what works, to put away what doesn't work, similar to the rules that had existed for decades, similar to the rules that existed when the Congress actually functioned, similar to the rules that existed when Democrats and Republicans didn't seem to have such difficulty working across the aisle. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.